Imagine discovering that your 11-year-old daughter disappeared during a less than 10-minute drive from a friend's house to your own. Now, imagine finding her dead in a cemetery, only to discover years later that the police lied about the evidence to frame an innocent man while the real killer walked free. This is the devastating story of Jodi Parrack and how a botched investigation nearly destroyed two families. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity to subscribe now and activate notifications so you don't miss our next cases. In a small town in Michigan called Constantine, with less than 1,000 inhabitants, lived a special little girl named Jodi Parrack. Born on September 2, 1996, she had an older brother and was raised by her mother, Valerie, known to everyone as Jo. Like any child her age, Jodi divided her time between school, family, and playing with friends in the neighborhood, always with her easy smile and her passion for animals and basketball. During a family trip to Chicago, something struck a chord in the little girl's heart. Upon seeing homeless people, Jodi told her parents that she wanted to be a hairdresser when she grew up. When asked why, her answer revealed impressive maturity for a child. She believed that when people feel beautiful, they also feel better about their lives. Her favorite quote was, "Love is like a hug, so hold on to it." And her generosity only grew with time. Unfortunately, neither Jodi nor her family could have predicted how bleak their future would become. It was Thursday, November 8, 2007, when at 5:45 p.m., Jo began to worry. Jodi had not returned from her best friend's house, violating the scheduled arrival time of 5:30 p.m., just enough time to eat dinner before it got dark. The route to her friend's house was familiar, less than half a mile away, a trip that normally took less than 10 minutes by bike. Trying to control her anxiety, Jo decided to go straight to her friend's house. There she discovered that neither Jodi nor the daughter of the house was present. Her friend's mother explained that both girls had already left when she got home from work, speculating that Jodi had probably accompanied her friend to the scout meeting that took place every Thursday. Hope was dashed when only one girl returned from the meeting. Jodi's friend confirmed that she had not gone to the scouts. She had left on her bike with enough time to make it home before the scheduled time. At that moment, Jo knew instinctively that something terrible had happened. He immediately called the police and began mobilizing friends and family. In a small town like Constantine, news of the disappearance spread quickly, and soon dozens of volunteers were searching parks, the banks of the St. Joseph River, and nearby fields. Hours of intensive searching revealed no sign of Jodi or her bike. That's when Jo heard a family friend suggest checking the local cemetery. After hearing the suggestion repeated a few times without anyone taking action, she decided to go herself. It was 10:30, minutes past 10, when Jo arrived at the cemetery. It was almost pitch black, broken only by a few distant streetlights. Even so, when she parked and looked out the window, she immediately noticed something that didn't belong there: the silhouette of a child leaning against a tombstone. Jo jumped out of the vehicle and ran toward the shadow. There, leaning against a random headstone, was the motionless body of her daughter, her beloved bicycle lying beside her in the dirt. Jo let out a heart-rending scream and hugged the little girl, kissing her head and begging her to wake up. Jodi looked angelic, her long eyelashes resting peacefully on her cheeks and her lips beginning to turn blue, but she was not breathing, and her body was cold and lifeless. Moments later, a police officer appeared in the cemetery parking lot. It was the same family friend who had recommended searching for Jodi at the cemetery the night of her disappearance. He had followed Jo and heard her scream as she found Jodi. Running toward the sound, he found Jo on the ground in the dark, holding her daughter's lifeless body. The officer, experienced enough to know that Jo would be devastated by the child's death, also knew that he needed to preserve the scene. He was well aware that 11-year-olds do not die for no reason, and everything around the body would be considered evidence for a future investigation. Eventually, as paramedics and police began arriving at the cemetery, Joe was convinced to release Jodi's body for the last time. The officers cordoned the area and began investigating the scene, while word spread through the small community that the girl that they had been searching for had been found, sadly, dead. Immediately, investigators realized that something about this case was peculiar. Jodi was found fully clothed, with no obvious signs of injury. There was no visible blood or bruising. It was almost as if she had simply sat down against the headstone and fallen asleep forever. Given the relative serenity of the scene, there was a possibility that Jodi had died of natural causes. Keeping an open mind about what happened to Jodi was not something Joe would ever consider. From the moment she realized her daughter was dead, Joe believed something had happened on the way back from her friend's house. She didn't hesitate to tell officers that she believed Jodi had been kidnapped, murdered, and abandoned in the few hours between when she left her friend's house and when she was found in the cemetery. Oddly, some community members suggested that perhaps Jodi had gone to the cemetery on her own, or perhaps she had been scared and died from an undiagnosed heart condition. But Joe knew there was no way Jodi had gone to the cemetery on her own. She remembered how much she hated going there. She didn't even like driving through the area. Whenever they did, Jodi would tell her mother that she was afraid of the place because it made her feel strange. Fortunately, investigators decided to treat Jodi's death as suspicious until the evidence said otherwise. They began their investigation by speaking with the girl's immediate family while the crime scene was still being processed. Since we know that the most likely person to hurt a child is someone close to them, officers took Joe and Brian, Jodi's older brother, to the police station for questioning. Both Joe and Brian spent hours providing detailed explanations of their movements on the day Jodi disappeared. Both denied any involvement in her death and could think of no one who would want to harm her or her family. After officers spoke with witnesses, they were able to determine that Joe and Brian's alibis were solid, and they were quickly ruled out as suspects. Meanwhile, Jodi's body was removed from the cemetery and taken for autopsy. The medical examiner confirmed that Jodi's cause of death was manual strangulation. In the case of manual strangulation, bodies show signs of bruising or bleeding around the neck and throat. But strangulation is suffocation, and it does not always require force to be applied to the airway. Jodi's body showed no outward signs of blunt force trauma, but she did have abrasions on her wrists, which were not visible when her body was found due to the fact that she was fully clothed. The marks on her wrists were consistent with having been handcuffed or tied up at some point prior to her murder. Bruising was also found on both of her nipples. Adding to the family's horror, there was evidence that Jodi had also been sexually assaulted. According to the autopsy, Jodi's time of death was 6:30 p.m., less than 2 hours after she had left to make the half-mile trip back to her friend's house. She was found wearing the black sweater and t-shirt she had disappeared in, along with her bra and underwear, white socks, and sneakers. Her favorite white earrings were still in her earlobes, and a friendship bracelet with multicolored beads was tied around her ankle. The coroner's report noted that although Jodi was found wearing socks and shoes, there was sand present between her toes. This indicated that her clothes had likely been removed at some point and she had been dressed by her killer. The autopsy confirmed that Jodi had suffered a horrific attack prior to her murder, but somehow the killer had left very little evidence as to exactly what had occurred. From day one, there was a huge amount of public interest in Jodi's case. Despite Constantine being a relatively small area, it has some of the highest rates of violent crime per capita in the United States. This disturbing statistic meant that the community was already on edge, and the disappearance of a young girl only heightened the sense of unease and urgency. Local police found themselves in the national spotlight as media outlets descended on the town to cover the story. The fact that the victim in this case was a child meant there was intense pressure on police to bring the killer to justice quickly. All of this context may have contributed to how the investigation went so wrong so quickly. The official announcement of Jodi's murder withheld her cause of death. It stands to reason that this may have been done so that when a suspect was questioned, the information could be used to determine his guilt or innocence. But the lack of clarity only heightened public fears that there was a crazed child killer running free in their community, which increased the pressure for results. Within days of Jodi's murder, police identified and publicly named their prime suspect. To the community's shock, it was none other than the family friend and police officer who had recommended searching for Jodi at the cemetery the night of her disappearance. Raymond McCann was a 46-year-old married man with 3 children of his own.
His regular job was repairing trailers, and he proudly held a position as a police reservist who could be called into the force when needed. He was known as a friendly guy who helped his neighbors, spoiled his children, and coached their sports teams. Jodi's mother had known Ray since they were both teenagers and had even dated Ray's brother at one point. As they grew older, their 2 families began to spend more time together until they considered themselves one big extended family. When they had children of their own, the children became best friends with each other. They were so close that on the day Jodi disappeared, it was Ray's niece she was visiting. No one wanted to believe that Ray could be involved. It was hard to imagine that a loving family man like him could have anything to do with the brutal murder of a child. And yet, everyone was also desperate to find out what had happened to Jodi and trusted what the police were saying. There was some relief that the crazed child killer everyone feared had been caught, even though he was someone they trusted so deeply. When Ray was brought in for questioning, he immediately denied any involvement in Jodi's murder or sexual assault. But when he was questioned about his movements on the afternoon Jodi was murdered, his answers seemed inconsistent, which only seemed to confirm what investigators already believed. Ray gave several different versions of the hours leading up to the time Jodi disappeared. In one version of events, he recalled that he had taken his children to the Dollar General store in Constantine after they returned from school that afternoon. But when his children were interviewed, they claimed that this was not true. They had never left the house after returning from school that day. Ray also denied owning any handcuffs other than the set he had for his reservist role, but the lead investigator stated that this was a false statement. Ray also stated that during the time of the search, he had entered a store and asked a female assistant if she had seen Jodi. However, when officers spoke to the employee, she was certain that the conversation had never taken place and that she had not spoken to Ray that day. Ray then claimed that he had spoken to a police officer that afternoon, but the officer also denied that the interaction had taken place. Ray then said that he had searched a nearby dam, but police said they had checked footage of the dam and Ray was not visible in it. With nothing to support Ray's alibi, the police became increasingly certain that he was the man they were looking for. Their suspicions were solidified when Joe told them that it was Ray who she had heard suggesting several times that they should check out the cemetery. When Ray was asked why he had told the prosecutors to look there, he stated that he had only suggested the cemetery because he was familiar with the area and did not think anyone had looked there yet. He said that he had already searched a local construction site as well as a baseball field without finding any sign of Jodi, and the cemetery was the next most obvious place in the area to look. Despite Ray's denials and there being only minimal circumstantial evidence linking him to the crime, the police were convinced that he was the killer. They had his proximity to Jodi and the inconsistent statements about his movements, and they were determined that this was enough to prove that Ray was the cold-blooded child killer they had been hunting. During the investigation, male DNA had been recovered from Jodi's body. Ray was determined to prove his innocence and voluntarily provided a DNA sample when he was first questioned. When he was brought in for questioning again, he was told that the DNA found on Jodi's body matched the sample he had given, and that Jodi's DNA had also been found inside his truck. Ray was at a loss to explain how his DNA had been found on the body or hers in his truck, but that didn't change his claim that he had nothing to do with her death. Ray's denials were seen as a stone wall by detectives, and yet, no matter what they said or threatened, he wouldn't budge on his claims of innocence. So investigators decided to take a new approach. They told both Joe and Ray's family that his DNA matched the samples Jodi's killer had left on her body. They backed it up by saying that the sand found between her toes definitely came from their backyard. Then they informed Ray's wife that he would be charged with murder. All of this might be considered standard in the course of a murder investigation, but they went a step further when they told Ray's son that his father was using and selling drugs and that he might be using his computer to meet a gay lover. Looking back, it's easy to see that they hoped to turn Ray's family against him and destroy his reputation, also that he would feel he had no choice but to finally confess what he had done. The plan worked, at least partially. Once the police had planted the seeds of doubt in Ray and Joe's families, there was no question in their minds that he was Jodi's killer. All they had to do was wait for the police to charge him with murder. Except they never did. 1 year after the murder turned into 2, then 3, 4, 5 years, and still no charges were filed against Ray. During that time, Ray gave numerous interviews to the media, begging and then demanding that Ray confess so she could finally receive the closure she deserved. Meanwhile, as the years passed, Ray was having his own interviews, except his were with law enforcement. In the 5 years following the murder, Ray was brought in for questioning 20 times. He always agreed to the interviews and never asked for an attorney to be present. No matter how many times he was questioned, he was always consistent about one thing. He had nothing to do with Jodi's kidnapping, sexual assault, or murder. It will come to no surprise that the way Ray was treated by investigators did not improve over the years. They used every tactic they had to try to break Ray and convince him to confess. Police kept coming back to the critical piece of evidence that proved Ray was the killer, the DNA that was found on Jodi. In an interview, Ray was repeatedly asked how his DNA could be on Jodi if he had nothing to do with her death. Once again, Ray was unable to provide an explanation until he eventually commented that perhaps it had gotten there after he made contact with Jo when he tried to get her to put Jodi's body down when she first arrived at the cemetery. Investigators also told Ray that they had evidence that showed he was 23 feet from Jodi when she died, an oddly specific number. They refused to explain what that evidence was. And of course, they kept going back to the CCTV footage that proved Ray was not searching the dam when he said he was. But that wasn't all they had against Ray. In an attempt to prove his innocence, he had agreed to take 3 polygraph tests. His first test was inconclusive, but the next 2 showed signs of cheating, at least according to investigators. In another tactic to try to get a confession out of Ray, officers offered suggested scenarios that could help explain why he sexually assaulted and killed an 11-year-old child. They suggested that perhaps it was an accident, or perhaps that Ray had a mental breakdown and blacked out and killed Jodi. But even that didn't work, and Ray stuck to his story. To everyone paying attention to the case, it seemed like the police had pretty compelling evidence to prove that Ray was the killer. And yet, despite their relentless efforts, Ray had not changed his statement once, and they never actually followed through with filing charges against him. Eventually, in 2012, 5 years after Jodi's death, lead investigator Brian Fuller decided to try one final tactic. He was sure that this would prove to be the turning point in the case and secure him a conviction. He established a cold case team that reopened the investigation into Jodi's murder. Ray was brought back for another interview and faced with the same line of questioning. Brian then subpoenaed Ray to testify under oath about his whereabouts on the day of Jodi's murder. He recounted the story of his search of the dam and mentioned searching the cemetery because it had not yet been examined. This testimony was then compared to his 20 previous statements about what he had done on the afternoon Jodi was taken. There were discrepancies in his recollections, especially regarding the search of the dam. Brian had testified that the footage of the dam proved that Ray had never been there on the day of the murder. This and the inconsistencies in Ray's testimony meant that in 2014, Ray was arrested by police while driving to the hospital to meet his newborn grandson for the first time. Except the arrest and subsequent charges weren't for murder. No, Ray was charged with 5 counts of perjury. In the state of Michigan, perjury carries a life sentence when it comes to capital murder. While Ray may not have been charged with murder, he was facing the same sentence as if he had been. The charges came as a relief to those following the case. Ray might not be convicted of the crime they were so passionate about, but he would still be locked away, and the community would finally be safe. While Ray was in jail awaiting trial for perjury charges, he realized there was no point in fighting a police force determined to convict him of basically anything. From his perspective, if there was footage showing that he never went to the dam, then the jury would likely rule against him, even though they believed his statement was true. In 2015, Ray pled no contest and was sentenced to 20 months in prison. He later stated that he knew the detectives would stop at nothing to convict him of something, so a no-contest plea would be the quickest way to return to his family.
He met his newborn grandson for the first time while incarcerated, commenting, "It was so hard to see him for the first time through the glass." While 20 months in prison was nothing like the 20 years the community thought Ray deserved, there was at least a small taste of justice for Jodi's family. Even though Ray was never charged with Jodi's murder, everyone involved believed he was the killer, and his arrest meant their children were safe. Except they weren't. It wouldn't be long before everyone realized they had been wrong all along. By focusing all their efforts on Ray, a child killer had been left to roam freely among their children. Now that Ray was locked away, the real monster was ready to strike again. On July 28, 2017, a decade after Jodi's murder, a 10-year-old girl told her parents a terrifying story about being attacked on her way home. She told them that as she passed a house on the street, a man had asked her to help him move something in his garage. As she approached the man, he pulled out a knife and covered her mouth with his hand. He tried to wrestle her to the ground, and she saw him reach for an extension cord. When he looked away, she took the opportunity to free herself from underneath him. She was able to run home and tell her parents what had happened. The girl's parents immediately notified the police, and she was asked to take them to the house where the attack had occurred. She took them to an address in White Pigeon, just 7 miles from where Jodi had lived and died. The house belonged to Daniel Kevin Furlong. Daniel was a father who worked as a youth sports coach, just as Ray had once been. He seemed like any perfectly ordinary, family-oriented guy. But behind the mask, Daniel was hiding a dark secret. When your DNA was put into the system, it returned a match to an unsolved crime in Constantine. I'm sure you made the connection, but it was a match to the DNA found on Jodi Parrack's body. Now the police had a dilemma. If Dan's DNA was a match for Jodi's killer, what was the situation with Ray's DNA? Had 2 separate DNA profiles been found on Jodi's body, or was something much more sinister at play? I think you know by now, it's always something more sinister. It turned out that Ray's DNA was not a match for the DNA found on Jodi's remains, and never had been. The police knew from the beginning that the DNA did not belong to Ray, and that he was likely not involved in her murder. And yet they knowingly chose to ignore the evidence and lied to try to get him to confess. But DNA wasn't the only evidence they lied about. The video footage they claimed proved Ray wasn't searching the dam like he said he was actually recorded from a building a block away. They would never have shown him if he was where he said he was. Brian Fuller had viewed the footage multiple times during the course of the investigation and was well aware of the location of the camera. As for the evidence Brian said proved that Ray was 23 feet from Jodi's body, well, that simply doesn't exist. There is no such test that can prove whether someone was within a certain radius of a murder. In fact, everything they told Ray in those 20 interviews was made up. They were all lies that they told with one intention: to scare Ray into confessing to a crime he didn't commit. In the United States, it is perfectly legal for police to lie to a suspect during an interrogation. They can say whatever they want if it helps them get the result they seek. They can fabricate evidence, mislead suspects, and produce false test results. When a suspect lies, it is perjury, but when the police lie, it is a legal and acceptable method of interrogation. It turns out that it is not uncommon for the pursuit of justice to be anything but fair. Now the police can say that everything was done with good intentions, except that in Ray's case, the evidence proved that Ray was not involved, not the other way around as the police had convinced everyone. It is clear from watching Ray's interviews that he is open and relaxed when being questioned by the investigators. He clearly wants to help and willingly answers all the questions they ask him. When interviewed, Daniel admitted that he was the one who killed Jodi and added that he had been planning to sexually assault and kill the girl who had escaped. Further investigation into Daniel's background revealed that he was living in Constantine at the time of Jodi's death. He told police that he had not known Jodi before that day, but when he saw her riding her bike past his house, he decided to call her. After that, he gave a brutal, moment-by-moment account of Jodi's final, horrific moments. Note the different tone of voice the detective takes when he speaks to Daniel. They are gentle and calm, with none of the aggression they showed toward Ray. They even thank him for speaking with them. Daniel casually describes how he started cleaning out his garage because the boys felt they were doing community trash collection that weekend in Constantine. Around 5 p.m., he saw a girl riding her bike down the street. He asked her to come help him move some stuff, and she got off her bike and walked up to the house. That's when he grabbed her and took her to the garage. Note how casually Daniel talks about the murder and how he constantly states, "if I remember correctly," or "if I'm not mistaken," as if he were talking about an incident that barely registered his interest. It took several more hours of interviews before Daniel confessed that he had in fact suffocated Jodi to death before they left the garage. After killing Jodi, Daniel returned home from the cemetery, tidied up the garage, and continued life as usual for nearly 10 years, while Ray's life was systematically destroyed by a murder he did not commit. In the intervening years between Jodi's murder and Daniel's confession, Ray's wife left him, he lost his job, his reputation was destroyed, and he had little to no relationship with his children and the extended family he once cherished. All of this because of a flawed and biased investigation and detectives who refused to consider any alternatives. But Daniel's confession didn't end Ray's nightmare. He was still in prison for perjury when the real culprit was finally identified. A few weeks after Daniel was formally charged, the Constantine police chief paid Ray a visit in prison. What Ray expected to be an apology for all the trouble they had caused turned out to be a new blow. The officer stated that he believed Ray and Daniel knew each other and were involved in Jodi's murder together. Ray was only released when he became eligible for parole in 2015. During his time in prison, he was the target of violent attacks for being a police officer and mainly for being associated with the brutal death of a child. In the first week, he was dragged from his bed, hit in the head with a padlock, and almost had his eyes gouged out by another inmate. He lost almost 30 kilos and began to suffer from depression and paranoia, illnesses that follow him to this day. And to make matters worse, Ray had not even committed perjury. The entire narrative put together by the police had been fabricated from the beginning. After release, he was contacted by the same lawyers involved in the Netflix series Making a Murderer and by representatives of the Michigan Innocence Clinic. All were convinced that Ray should never have been charged. They said the alleged contradictions in his testimony were caused by the systematic lies told by the investigators during interrogations. The lawsuit alleged that Ray was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by the police themselves. The prosecution argued that the techniques used by the detectives went beyond all ethical and legal limits and were clearly designed to mislead him. Even so, the prosecutor responsible for the initial prosecution defended himself, stating that he followed all the correct procedures. In 2017, Ray finally cleared his name. A judge overturned his perjury conviction after the University of Michigan Innocence Clinic and other legal groups worked together. The decisive piece of evidence was the discovery that the footage supposedly proving Ray had not been at the dam had been filmed more than a block away, a fact the police were already well aware of. Even after this legal victory, Ray only received $40,000 in compensation for the months he spent unjustly imprisoned. But his fight was not over. In September 2013, Ray filed a lawsuit against the lead investigator in the Jodi Parrack case, Sergeant Brian Fuller. The lawsuit alleged malicious prosecution and violation of legal rights. In his deposition, Fuller admitted that he had lied throughout the investigation, justifying his actions with the statement, "I did what was best for the investigation. I wanted to solve the case." During the trial, the sergeant revealed that he had come to believe that Ray's teenage son might have been involved and that Ray was covering for the boy. In a recording played in court, Fuller is seen questioning Ray's son and referring to the victim as a brat who had hit on him. That's right, he called an 11-year-old girl who was murdered a brat. Still, Brian's lawyers tried to argue that he had followed all procedures correctly and that Ray had in fact committed perjury. The defense insisted that the video footage showed that Ray had lied, but the court disagreed. The jury sided with Ray. He was eventually awarded $14.5 million. After the verdict, Jodi's mother Jo gave a public interview and apologized to Ray for everything he had gone through over the past 15 years. She had believed that he was the killer because that is what the police had told her over and over again. It was only after the truth came out that she realized how much she had been manipulated.
Ray,
on the other hand, has never received a formal apology from the police officers, investigators, or prosecutors who destroyed his life. And, most likely, he never will. This story has multiple victims: Jodi Parrack and her family, first and foremost, but also Ray McCann and his family, who were dragged into a nightmare by the stubbornness of a system that refuses to admit mistakes. And finally, the other girl who escaped Daniel Furlong's attack, a crime that could have been prevented if investigators had done their job right from the start. The real monster behind Jodi's death is in jail, and we hope he never gets out. As for the detective responsible for this whole tragedy, he's still working as a police officer in the state of Michigan. And honestly, may God protect the innocents who will still cross his path. If you've stayed this far, please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave your comment. Suggest new cases you'd like to see here. Your participation helps our work a lot. See you next time.